In August 2017, hundreds of white supremacists marched through Charlottesville, Virginia at the Unite the Right rally. They carried torches, symbols of racism, hatred, and violence. They chanted, "Jews will not replace us." As activists protested against this hate-filled gathering, one avowed white supremacist, who apparently kept a photograph of Hitler on his nightstand, drove his car into the crowd, killing a 32-year-old woman. In the wake of this terrifying and tragic day, former President Donald Trump said that there were, quote, "very fine people on both sides of the rally in Charlottesville." We Jews know well what comes of mainstreaming hatred, bigotry, anti-Semitism. Do you remember the 2006 movie titled Borat, Cultural Learnings of America for Make Benefit Glorious Nation of Kazakhstan? It was a so-called mockumentary, a social experiment. Borat, played by Jewish actor Sacha Baron Cohen, comes from Kazakhstan to learn all about our culture. The movie records various escapades in Borat's travels, some silly and some more serious. But it becomes clear as you watch that Borat is exposing some very ugly truths about Americans. In one scene, Borat goes into a bar in Tucson. He's invited to sing on stage. His Kazakh version of a country western song intrigues the folks drinking in the bar. This 2.5-minute scene is surprising and terrifying. Borat encourages the bar patrons to sing along with him. Quickly, they're clapping and having a jolly good time. The crowd's fervor reaches a high as Borat encouraged them to participate in his song, "Throw the Jew Down the Well." Sacha Baron Cohen's character reveals an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in our country as discovered in a bar that could be anywhere, USA. Even more terrifying, the skit displays the willingness of people to go along with the crowd. Are the people in the bar truly anti-Semites? Maybe, or maybe not. They may not have even spent much time considering how they feel about Jews. But they're willing to sing about killing Jews 1 minute into a stranger's performance. It is shocking to see how readily people participated in this hateful song. That movie came out in 2006. In the last 17 years since then, bigotry has become an acceptable part of mainstream American behavior. And white nationalism has been on the rise. When the president of our country declares white supremacists to be, quote, "very fine people," something is rotten at the core of our nation. Fundamentalist nationalism is antithetical to our democracy and to the core values of this country, but they've become acceptable in America. Unfortunately, the rise in bigoted nationalism that we've seen in this country is consistent with an international trend. Recently, the Washington Post reported on what it called the threat from far-right populism, a movement that has come to the forefront of American politics. Populism is an ideology that supports the people, a self-identified downtrodden group trying to gain strength over those perceived to hold the power. The people are defined along class, ethnic, or national lines. Wikipedia explains that, quote, "populist parties and social movements are often led by charismatic or dominant figures who present themselves as the voice of the people." Well, which people? White nationalism has become the movement of the people who define themselves as true Americans, as opposed to those of us whose families came as more recent immigrants. The people marching in Charlottesville were white supremacists and white nationalists wanting to take back their rightful opportunities. Hence the rioters yelling, "The Jews will not replace us." But America is not alone. These dangerous nationalist views are spreading around Europe as well. The Washington Post's cautionary article was referring to the many far-right populist governments which are now in power in Europe: Italy, Sweden, Hungary, Russia, Turkey, to name a few. All these countries now have leaders who represent far-right populist parties. They believe that people of, quote, authentic ethnic origin should take back their own countries. In the 1930s, Hitler used the same concepts to define the Aryan race, those he considered to be true Germans. What's to stop a populist frenzy from taking over Europe again? A New York Times article from July calls out this situation. The article is titled, "What's Happening in Italy is Scary and It's Spreading." Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, is referred to as a populist firebrand, running a, quote, nativist government. The author, David Broder, writes, Ms. Meloni's administration has spent its first months accusing minorities of undermining the triad of God, nation, and family, with dire practical consequences for migrants, non-governmental organizations, and same-sex parents. The article continues laying out a very troubling scene of European governments that are all based on similar ideology. Broder writes, allies of Ms. Meloni are already in power in Poland, in Sweden, in Finland. Italy's populist government has sought to take rights away from all people perceived to be a threat to the proper Italian way of life. Their right-wing ideology has created policies to disenfranchise people who are perceived to be antithetical to true Italian values. They've taken particularly strong aim at LGBTQ rights to parenthood and immigration rights. One government minister who happens to be Meloni's brother-in-law has led the appeal for resistance to what he calls, quote, ethnic replacement. Meloni herself has called for a policy of births, not migrants. These governments are increasingly taking power to represent long-ignored voters. The article concludes with these cautionary words. The disturbing truth is that these are no longer parties of protest, but increasingly welcome in the mainstream. For proof, just look to Washington. Are we leading the way? A right-wing nationalist ideology has come into the mainstream in America and Europe, but it doesn't stop there. No doubt you've read about what's going on in Israel these days. The Netanyahu government is a coalition government comprised of far-right parties who wield disproportionate power and dangerous populist tendencies. They've been rallying those who will listen, who feel disenfranchised, to take back their rightful power. Women, people of color, LGBTQ folks, Arabs, Reformed Jews, all are a threat to their power structure. Israel's current government has relied on populist ideals to invent policies that will disenfranchise so many people in Israeli society. We find ourselves in a very difficult moment in modern Israel's 75-year history, because for 75 years and 3,000 years before that, we Jews had a shared vision of a Jewish homeland. Theodore Herzl famously said, Im tirtzu ein zo agada, if you will it, it is no dream. As the Zionist ideal developed, many thinkers defined an Israel for Jews and non-Jews alike. It was to be governed by the highest ideals of inclusion as dictated by our Torah. The Zionist vision of Israel imagined a Jewish state for all Jewish people, a place where Jews of any background, skin color, religious observance would all be equally at home. And the Zionist vision allowed non-Jewish people to be given the same rights and privileges of protection in the Jewish land. Nativism is antithetical to Zionism. The Torah so clearly instructs us to welcome the stranger, to treat our neighbors like we treat each other, to include the Ger Toshav, the non-Jews who live together with us as part of one society. That's the core of a Zionist vision of a modern state of Israel. It's also the core of an ancient view of Israelite society, dating back to our wandering in the desert. Tomorrow morning, we will read from Parshat Nitzavim. It's the Torah portion chosen by the rabbis to be read every year on Yom Kippur because they believed it was the most important Torah portion to hear on this day. It begins, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. You stand, all of you, on this day before Adonai your God. The next verses go on to list who exactly is standing together. The chieftains, the workers, the old, the young, men and women, everyone who makes up our society. God gives instruction to all of us as we stand together to hear the words. The Torah instructs that our society must include all different kinds of people, standing shoulder to shoulder. So how did we get to this terrible place of bigotry controlling Israel's government? This moment in modern Israeli history is unique. Something has gone wrong. A populist government that wants to redirect power to a small fraction of society has grabbed control, and they're trying to dismantle the modern state of Israel as we know it. By attempting to change the Supreme Court's role in society, the government is trying to take away rights currently protected by a separation of powers. With no checks and balances in place, it would be very easy for the government to take away our rights. Rights of Reformed Jews, rights of Reformed synagogues to exist in Israel, rights of Jews converted by Reform rabbis, and rights of women, Arabs, LGBTQ folks. 2 weeks ago, Israel's Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, made a public statement claiming, quote, the right of Jewish settlers to move around freely on the roads of Judea and Samaria is more important than the right of movement of Arabs. According to him, the need to ensure the safety of Jews living in the West Bank can preclude Arabs from using the same roads for transportation. By turning Israel into an ever more ultra-Orthodox nationalist state that defines insiders narrowly, Israel could become a theocracy. It would be hard to distinguish from any other country based on religious fundamentalism. The fabric of Israeli society is being ripped apart by this fundamentalism. Could there be a civil war? Jews against Jews? It's unthinkable. The democracy movement of the last many months in Israel is truly astounding. People have voted with their feet, marching in the streets, and attending pro-democracy rallies every single Saturday night for months and months. When John and I were in Israel in June, we decided to see the protests for ourselves. Right after Shabbat, we headed to the center of the rallies. As we started to walk toward the protests, we saw thousands and thousands of people ahead of us, all ages, all backgrounds, protesting the government. We saw people waving flags, big flags, wearing flags, wrapped in Israeli flags, as they gathered to protest their government's policies, The journalist Yossi Klein Halevi was here on this bima in May. Our inspiring conversation was recorded. If you haven't had a chance to watch, I recommend that you do that. Halevi talked about the extraordinary nature of these protests. Thousands and thousands of centrist, middle-aged Israelis are on the streets every single Saturday night. These protests are not demonstrations of extreme liberals or bright-eyed 20-somethings. No, these protests are fueled by a spontaneous outpouring of love for Israel coming from the heart of the country. They are an expression of Israelis' belief in a country based on democracy and inclusivity and pluralism. The good news is Israelis are not sitting idly by and allowing their democracy to be dismantled. There is no silent acceptance of policies that are antithetical to the founding values of the State of Israel. It is important on this most sacred day in our calendar to stop and take an accounting of where we are, personally and collectively. What's happening around the world? Supremacist ideologies are gaining power and giving power to dangerous governments. What does the future look like? The rabbis of old were wise, giving us instruction to apply to these challenging times. Natati lefanecha ha'chaim v'hamavet habracha v'haklala. Tomorrow we will hear these words chanted, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Bacharta b'chaim laman tichye ata v'zarecha. You individually and collectively have big choices to make in life, the Torah says, so that you and your children will live. The Torah instructs us that our actions will decide our fate. What can we do to make a difference? We must remain vigilant, reading and educating ourselves about the politics of other nations. We can never say that another country's policies are irrelevant to us. You've probably heard the famous quote from the German minister, Pastor Martin Niemöller. About the Nazis, he said, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. It is the responsibility of all of us as Jews to guard individual freedoms wherever they are compromised. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself, he said, and in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. We are responsible to speak up. Bigoted and supremacist ideologies and governments anywhere in the world threaten us directly. When it comes to Israel, we have an obligation to engage ourselves in current events. I moderated a panel a couple of weeks ago about the Jewish future. Among the speakers on the panel was Zach Bodner, who has been on the forefront of the Israel-U.S. conversation for a long time. You may have known him when he was the regional director of AIPAC. He's recently written a book on modern Israel. He said that at this moment we find ourselves in a unique situation as Jews, where both Israel and the diaspora have thriving Jewish communities. Throughout history, one or the other has been a place of relative security and Jewish life. But now, both Israel and the diaspora communities are strong, and so our relationship to Israel is different than ever before. Israel is a modern state with a thriving economy and booming tech industry. It's a country of medical invention and environmental innovation. In decades past, American Jews felt a need to protect a fledgling Israel. Now we must approach Israel as a country fully capable of being autonomous. We must hold Israel to the highest standards that we expect both of a democratic nation and a country that has at its core our own values guiding it. We must show our support for Israel and our condemnation of any policies that don't equally protect the rights of all of its citizens. But our job isn't only to criticize Israel or the policies of its government. Our job is also to be in awe of what we've built together. A strong and independent democracy in which people can take to the streets and speak their minds. When Yossi Klein Halevi finished his interview on this bima, I asked him what we should do to support democracy in Israel. Get on a bus, he said, and come to the protest Saturday night. I thought he was kidding, and I smiled. No, really, he said, I'll meet you there. I think we should take a delegation, a group of congregants from our community who want to, as Heschel said, pray with our feet. Seeing firsthand the peaceful and strong protests in Tel Aviv inspired me to understand the significance of this moment in history. And the words of our Yom Kippur Torah portion, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life that you and your children may live. Our actions will determine the future. Reading about and discussing the situation must be a priority for all of us. Supporting organizations that help ensure a strong Jewish and democratic civil society in Israel are crucial at this time. The International Movement for Progressive Judaism in Israel, that's the Reform movement in Israel, may well lose all of its government funding. We need to be there. So many organizations, the New Israel Fund, the Israel Religious Action Center, the American Jewish Committee, and many other organizations are working hard to ensure that this time in Israel brings about strength. We must be present, whether on a Saturday night in Tel Aviv or here in San Francisco, attending lectures and demonstrations and insisting on an Israel whose values we believe in. And then there's the question of our own country, our own government, and our fellow Americans. Right here where we live, we cannot tolerate the insidious bigotry and nationalism that has cast a dark shadow over our own nation. We must speak out and ensure that our political leaders are not people who incite hatred. Vote, vote, vote. Vote for leaders who share the values of inclusivity and pluralism. We cannot give up on the America we believe in, the America we love. January 6, 2021 was one of the bleakest moments in the history of our country. Democracy itself was at risk. But that night, Amanda Gorman, our National Youth Poet Laureate, finished her poem titled The Hill We Climb. Gorman recited this beautiful poem at the presidential inauguration just 2 weeks after the attack on the Capitol. It's a powerful statement for our challenging time and a modern illustration of our Yom Kippur Torah portion's instruction to engage with the challenges before us, to choose life and blessing for the generations to come. For this time, Amanda Gorman wrote, "For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. So while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe, now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." Gamar Chatima Tova, may we be inscribed for life and for blessing in the book of life.